It is May 1941. A stateless 34-year-old Jewish woman arrives in New York Harbor without a penny in her pocket. She has just spent 8 years fleeing the Nazis across Europe, barely escaping the Holocaust and witnessing the descent of an entire civilization into the abyss of fascist rule. But this woman carries with her a mind unlike any other. She is already a philosopher of the highest caliber, trained by some of the greatest thinkers of the age. In the decades to come, she will answer the question that comes to define the 20th century: how ordinary people consented to the mass murder of their neighbors. And she will teach the world to recognize the warning signs of fascism before it is too late. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank all our YouTube members and Patreons. Your solidarity translates directly into more videos more often. If you're able to support us, you'll find links to our Patreon in the video description. If not, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps other curious minds discover the channel. With that said, let's now begin our story on the remarkable life of Hannah Arendt, a political mind like no other. Chapter 1. A Königsberg Childhood. On October 14th, 1906, in a small town called Linden, just outside Hanover, a baby girl arrived in a comfortable, secular household. Her family, German Jewish and thoroughly assimilated, soon packed up and moved east to a city that no longer exists on modern maps. Königsberg, the old capital of East Prussia, sat on the Baltic, a place of 7 bridges and salt-laced air. It was also the city of Immanuel Kant, the 18th century philosopher who spent his life walking the same cobbled streets at the same time each day, obsessed with logic, with duty, and with the strict moral rules he believed bound every rational mind. Into this city, the Arendts brought their only child, Hannah. The household she grew up in belonged to what the Germans called the educated middle class. German culture was everything here. Goethe was read aloud at the dinner table. Kant sat on the bookshelf with the weight of scripture. Synagogue, by contrast, was nowhere. Jewish ritual had faded from daily life generations before, leaving behind only the name and the memory. Her mother, Martha, was something more unusual. A cosmopolitan woman with sharp opinions and sharper convictions. She admired Rosa Luxemburg, the firebrand revolutionary who, alongside the Spartakists, had tried to seize Germany after the First World War in the name of the working class. She was no party member, but the politics ran through her like a current, and it would run through her daughter too. Hannah's father, Paul, was an engineer, a quiet, scholarly man. He kept a vast library of Greek and Latin and German classics, and he loved his daughter with a particular tenderness. But Paul was already dying when Hannah was born. He had contracted syphilis years earlier, and the disease was slowly eating away at his mind, causing severe brain damage that doctors at the time could neither halt nor explain. Martha kept a diary of Hannah's early years, titled simply Our Child, documenting first words and small fevers and the steady, terrible decline of the man in the next room. Paul died in 1913. Hannah was 7. The loss never quite left her. The big questions of philosophy, the ones about why anything exists at all, would always feel to her like personal urgencies rather than puzzles to be solved in a seminar room. In Paul's library, the leather-bound Goethe and Schiller, the great giants of German letters, stood beside the Greek lexicons. She would later say that the German language itself became her homeland, the one thing she could carry with her wherever she went. As German as the family was, they remained Jews in the eyes of many others. The word Jew never came up when I was a small child, Hannah later recalled. I first met with it through the anti-Semitic remarks of children on the street. From that moment on, I was, so to speak, enlightened. Martha had a rule for moments like that. If a teacher said something cruel, Hannah was to stand up, walk out of the classroom, come home, and tell her mother. Then Martha would write a registered letter of complaint, and the school authorities would be horrified, and Hannah would simply not be there for whatever came next. Defend yourself, but do not be ashamed. The Arendts would not crouch. They would not apologize for existing. They would not be the kind of Jews who tried to slip quietly into Christian society, hoping to be tolerated. They would be the other kind, the kind who stood in the open and refused to look away. The fatherless child threw herself into study. She taught herself ancient Greek so she could read Homer and Sophocles in the original, and she absorbed the political life of the ancient Greek city-state as though it were a living thing. At 14, she pulled Kant's Critique of Pure Reason from her father's shelf and began to work through it. Then came Kierkegaard, the melancholy Dane who wrote about anxiety and faith, and Karl Jaspers, the German philosopher who insisted that thinking should be a matter of existence itself, not a parlor game. Outside, the world she had been born into was coming apart. The First World War ended. The empire fell. The Weimar Republic stumbled forward through hyperinflation, when bread cost millions of marks, and a wheelbarrow of cash bought a single loaf, and the Spartacist uprising flared and was crushed. The settled, polite, 19th century world of her parents was simply gone. Then, at 15, Hannah organized a boycott of a teacher who had insulted her. The school expelled her. Martha did not flinch. She sent her teenage daughter to Berlin to live on her own and audit university lectures, particularly those of Romano Guardini, the Catholic theologian who taught Kierkegaard as though every word were a matter of life or death. Hannah sat in cold lecture halls in a city full of cabarets and political violence, and she barely noticed the cabarets. She passed her university entrance exams as an external candidate. She did not need the school system. She had never needed it. Then, in 1924, a rumor reached her through a childhood friend. In the picturesque medieval town of Marburg, there was a young professor, almost entirely unpublished, who was doing something extraordinary. He was making philosophy live again. Students spoke of him in hushed tones, the hidden king, the brilliant and famously elusive teacher whose seminars felt less like lectures than excavations of the soul. One could perhaps, she thought, learn to think. She packed her bags. At 18, armed with Kant and Greek and her mother's instruction to never apologize, Hannah boarded a train heading south into the fog and stone of a small university town. She was going to find her teacher. She had no idea what else she would find there. Chapter 2. Heidegger, Marburg, and the Beginning of Thinking. The rain falls steadily on the cobblestones of Marburg in the autumn of 1924. The medieval university town hunches under low grey skies, its narrow streets winding up toward the castle. Hannah had come to this place for one man. She had come for the lectures of Martin Heidegger. At 35, Heidegger was already a legend in the making. He was married to a fiercely nationalistic woman named Elfried, the father of 2 young sons, and he was feverishly drafting the manuscript that would become Being and Time, a book that would shake 20th century thought to its foundations. The rumors about him had reached Königsberg long before Hannah did. They said he philosophized like a peasant. They said he skied to his lectures dressed in the traditional garb of the Black Forest, spoke with the heavy accent of rural Swabia, a deeply traditional working-class region in Germany's south, about as far from cosmopolitan Berlin as one could imagine. He had rejected the polite, polished, academic philosophy of his elders, the Neo-Kantians, whose work had grown rigid and rule-bound, drained of any sense of lived experience. Heidegger wanted philosophy to feel like something. Phenomenology, his method, was a way of paying close, painstaking attention to direct human experience, to what it actually feels like to exist, to be alive in a world. Hannah walked into his packed seminar room, this striking young Jewish woman in her trench coat, and the air, by all accounts, changed. The affair began almost at once. It was secret, it was consuming, and it was conducted in the shadows. He would signal her with a lamp in his office window, a small flame in the dusk, telling her when it was safe to come. He sent her letters. "I can never call you mine," he wrote, "but from now on you will belong in my life, and my life will grow with you." His career was protected. His marriage was protected. She was the one who had to disappear and reappear at his command. And the silence was crushing. She hid her subjection from her mother, from her peers, from the wider university. She wrote a poem during these months called Shadows, in which she tried to put words to the loss of herself, the dissolving of the line between what was hers and what belonged to him. On the street, he might pass her with barely a nod. In private, his letters fused philosophical inquiry with romantic obsession, drawing her deeper into an intellectual labyrinth from which there seemed no exit. She was 19 years old. Eventually, she did what survival required. She left. In 1926, she transferred to Heidelberg, seeking the guidance of Karl Jaspers, who was everything Heidegger was not. A psychiatrist turned philosopher, Jaspers believed deeply in human communication, in reason, in the shared political world. He read her work alongside his wife Gertrude, in long evening conversations in their Heidelberg study, treating her not as a disciple but as a colleague. After Tottenberg, after the lamp in the window, this felt like coming up for air. Under Jasper's supervision, she wrote her doctoral dissertation, completed in 1929, on love and St. Augustine. And already, in her first major work, she was turning away from Heidegger. He had built his philosophy around death, around the lonely figure he called Dasein, his term for the isolated individual confronting their own mortality. Hannah turned instead toward birth, toward what she would come to call natality, the fact that each of us enters the world capable of beginning something new, toward what Augustine called amor mundi, the love of the world. She wrestled in those pages with how a person could love the world and their neighbor without fleeing into the safety of eternal things. "There is no greater assertion of life," she wrote, "than a yes spoken to the world." The seeds of everything she would later think were already there. Being and Time was published in 1927. It made Heidegger internationally famous overnight. Hannah read it with the strange, painful intimacy of someone who knew the man who'd written it. She recognized the brilliance. She remained suspicious of its silence on how human beings might act together, politically, in a shared world. In 1928, they met once more, briefly, at a hotel after her graduation. In a letter to him that August, she quoted Elizabeth Barrett Browning, "And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death." The gulf between them was now beyond closing. She wanted normalcy. She wanted air. She met a young left-wing intellectual named Günther Stern, a former student of Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology himself. The courtship was rapid, almost unsentimental. They went to a masquerade ball in Berlin, where she arrived dressed as a harem girl, swept up in the wild exuberance of Weimar nightlife. They married in 1929. They took a small apartment in Berlin. He worked toward an academic career. She wrote for local newspapers and began the deep historical research into German Jewish life that would carry her soon enough into far darker waters. The Jewish Question and the Pariah. The marriage to Günther was, by her own quiet later admissions to a few trusted friends, a kind of rebound, a deliberate act. She wanted the shape of a settled life after the storm of Marburg, the role of a married woman with an address and a husband and a future. Günther, meanwhile, was attempting to climb the steep wall of German academia, working toward what was called a habilitation, the postdoctoral qualification that stood as the final, towering hurdle before a man could call himself a professor. He was trying to win the approval of the theologian Paul Tillich in Frankfurt, and it wasn't going well. The walls of the academy were already growing colder for Jewish scholars, and a creeping, unspoken anti-Semitism had begun to seep into the corridors where philosophy was supposed to live untouched by such things. Berlin in 1929 was a city teetering. The cafes hummed with the strange, frantic energy of a republic running out of time. Unemployed men loitered in long, patient lines. Street brawls broke out between communists and the brown-shirted Nazi stormtroopers, the paramilitaries of a movement still small enough to be dismissed and large enough to be terrifying. Into this teetering world, a 23-year-old newlywed settled into a small apartment and began work on a thesis about a long-dead Prussian Jewish woman. Her name was Rahel van Hagen, a salon host of the early 1800s whose attic correspondence had survived, and who, through her thousands of unpublished letters, would open a window onto the exact neuroses of German Jewish assimilation. The research routine took her into the cavernous reading rooms of the Prussian State Library. Day after day, she sat at the long wooden tables, reading the handwritten letters of a woman who had spent her entire life trying to scrub away her Jewishness. Rahel had changed her name, first to Robert, then to Anthony Friederike. She had baptized herself a Christian. She had married a minor Prussian diplomat to secure a title. The letters told the story of a woman trapped in constant performance, terrified of being exposed, exchanging her authentic self for an invitation to an aristocratic drawing room. And out of those letters, two figures began to emerge in Hannah's mind. Two ways of being Jewish in a society that didn't quite want you. The first she called the parvenu, the social climber, the assimilator, the one who tries to buy entry into the ruling class by paying with their own soul. The parvenu mirrors the prejudices of the dominant culture, sometimes adopting a casual anti-Semitism to prove their separation from the Jewish masses. Society accepts the performance, never the person. The parvenu, she wrote, pays for his assimilation with the loss of his own qualities. Against this stood the second figure, the pariah, the outcast who refuses the bargain, who keeps a kind of internal freedom precisely by accepting their exclusion. The conscious pariah, she came to believe, was the only truly human figure left in a society built on shutting people out. The emotional climax of the research arrived on a deathbed in 1833. Rahel van Hagen, at the end of her life, finally stopped running. Her husband recorded her last words, and Hannah found them in the archive. the thing which all my life seemed to me the greatest shame, which was the misery and misfortune of my life, having been born a Jewess. This I should on no account now wish to have missed. A whole existence spent fleeing a phantom, and the recognition, at the end, that what she had tried to erase was the very thing that had made her human. Outside the library walls, the Weimar Republic was beginning to come apart. Unemployment lines stretched around city blocks. Parliament deadlocked. And the academic colleagues who had once debated Kant and Kierkegaard with her began rationalizing the necessity of a strongman, viewing the rising Nazi movement through detached theoretical lenses that blinded them completely to the violence happening in the streets. Then, on the 30th of January, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Less than a month later, on the night of the 27th of February, the sky over the Tiergarten Park glowed orange. The Reichstag, the German parliament building, was burning. And the fire was the pretext Hitler had been waiting for to seize absolute dictatorial power. Within 24 hours, civil liberties were suspended. Freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, all of it gone overnight. By morning, communists, socialists, and opponents of the regime were being dragged from their beds into the cellars of the SA, the Nazi stormtroopers, where the first torture centers had already been improvised. And then came the betrayal that broke her, perhaps permanently, with philosophy itself. Her professors, her colleagues, the German intellectual establishment did not resist. They participated. They aligned themselves through what the regime called Gleichschaltung, forced coordination, the systematic process by which every institution in Germany, the universities, the courts, the professional associations, was brought into line with Nazi ideology. Her own teachers found sophisticated historical justifications for anti-Semitism. She would later put it with uncompromising clarity. I no longer wanted anything to do with philosophy. It was no longer a matter of the intellectual's individual acts of betrayal, but of the fact that the intellectual establishment as such had gone along. She turned now to Kurt Blumenfeld, the secretary of the German Zionist Federation, a man she had known since her student days at Heidelberg. When he first came to address the Zionist Student Club there in 1926, from him she absorbed a hard new sentence. If one is attacked as a Jew, one must defend oneself as a Jew. The apartment she shared with her radical-minded mother quietly became a way station for fugitives, communists, and socialists seeking forged papers and a quick exit toward Czechoslovakia, soup on the stove. Hushed voices, an ear cocked for footsteps on the stairs. And Blumenfeld brought her a request. The World Zionist Organization in Paris needed proof, hard documentary proof, of the slow legal strangulation of German Jewish life. So Hannah returned once more to the long wooden tables of the Prussian State Library. Surrounded by quiet scholars and uniformed state officials, she opened her small notebooks and began transcribing, by hand, the boycott notices, the professional exclusions, the bureaucratic edicts of a country dismantling its own citizens. The notebooks grew thicker. They sat in a stack on the desk in her Berlin apartment, and one afternoon, heavy boots came up the wooden stairs of her building and stopped at her door. Chapter 4. Arrest, Escape, and Statelessness. The boots belonged to the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police. They came in the spring of 1933, and they tore the apartment apart with a thoroughness that felt almost rehearsed. Books pulled from shelves, drawers emptied onto the floor. The notebooks she had been filling for weeks, the careful evidence of anti-Semitic propaganda gathered from the Prussian State Library, were now in the hands of the men rifling through her desk. Hannah and her mother Martha were taken together, bundled into a vehicle, and driven across Berlin to Alexanderplatz, the central headquarters of the city's police. What followed was 8 days of waiting. 8 days inside a holding cell with no sense of what charges might emerge or whether charges were even the point. The officer who came to question her turned out to be young, newly appointed, and visibly uncertain about how to handle the woman across the table. She saw this almost immediately, and so she began to perform. A naive scholar, a young academic who really couldn't say what all the fuss was about. She lied beautifully and with composure. Every name she might have given, she swallowed. Her Zionist contacts, the people who had asked her to do this work in the first place, remained safe because she absorbed the entire weight of the suspicion onto herself. The officer, perhaps because he was inexperienced, perhaps because he simply liked her, arranged for her release pending a trial. That trial would never come. The legal machinery of the Weimar Republic was already dissolving into something else. She walked out, collected her mother, and made the decision within the hour. They had 24 hours to disappear. They left behind everything: the library, the papers, the apartment, the furniture, the city she had grown up visiting. They travelled south toward the Ore Mountains, where the border with Czechoslovakia ran through quiet villages and pine forests. The route depended on a small piece of clandestine architecture, a sympathetic family whose house had been built directly on the frontier. The front door opened into Germany. The back door opened into the woods of Bohemia. After dark, mother and daughter walked through that hallway and out the other side, undocumented, unregistered, and no longer citizens of anywhere. Prague first. Then a brief stretch in Geneva, working at the League of Nations. And by the autumn of that same year, Paris. This was her introduction to statelessness, which she would come to understand as a fundamental breakdown of a person's reality. To lose your citizenship was to lose the world itself, the scaffolding of laws and recognitions that allow a life to take shape. Daily existence in Paris was reduced to standing in lines at the immigration bureaucracy, applying for an identity card and travel document for people without a country. The lines were long and the clerks were tired. Still, she worked. She found a position helping Jewish refugees retrain for manual labor. Then, more significantly, she became General Secretary for Youth Aliyah in France, organizing the rescue of Jewish teenagers out of Germany. The children were placed on farms in the French countryside, taught to work the land, and then sent in clandestine convoys to the kibbutzim of Palestine, the collective agricultural settlements being built there. The hardest part of the job was the parents. Sitting with them, persuading them to let their children go, watching them not yet understand what was coming. In the evenings, she drifted to the cafes around Rue Soufflot, in the Latin Quarter near the Sorbonne, where the displaced German Jewish intelligentsia gathered to argue and grieve and pretend things might still turn out. It was there she met Walter Benjamin, one of the great minds of his generation, a literary critic and philosopher whose essays on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction had reshaped how a whole continent thought about culture. He also happened to be a distant cousin of Hannah's first husband. Benjamin lived in genteel poverty in a tiny flat crammed with books, wandering Paris as a kind of urban observer, a flaneur, hoarding ideas no publisher quite wanted. They played chess together. They read Kafka. They talked endlessly about Marxist history and Jewish mysticism, two ways of asking whether the catastrophes of the world might be redeemed, one through revolution and the other through a hidden spark of the divine. Her marriage to Gunther Stern had been quietly dying for some time. The pressures of exile finished it. He sailed for America in 1936, and the divorce was finalized without drama. That same year she met Heinrich Blücher, and her life shifted on its axis. Blücher was a working-class Berliner, self-taught, a former Spartacist who had fired a rifle in the streets during the failed revolution of 1919. He had no university degree. He had no philosophical pedigree. He had only a fearless, restless political mind and an absolute refusal to consider himself a victim of anything. They walked the boulevards together for hours. He taught her to see imperialism and class and power as living mechanisms rather than abstractions. She taught him whatever she taught him. In January of 1940, in a city already bracing for invasion, they signed the civil documents and married. It was, in its way, the most defiant thing two stateless people could do. Karl Jaspers would later describe Hannah in this period as a woman wandering through the world, exposed to the elementary horrors of our existence. The phony war, that strange 8-month silence after Germany invaded Poland but before it turned west, gave Paris a few months of false calm. Then, in the spring of 1940, the sirens began. The French Third Republic, the democratic government that would not survive the year, panicked. New decrees arrived. Every German national on French soil, including the Jewish refugees who had spent 7 years running from Hitler, was reclassified as an enemy alien. Posters went up across the city. Foreign men first, then foreign women, were ordered to report to the velodromes, the indoor cycling stadiums now repurposed as mass holding pens. Chapter 5. Gurs and the Flight to America. Hannah, now 33 years old, gathered her papers, a change of clothes, and made her way to the winter velodrome. The wooden bleachers rose up around her in steep tiers. The floodlights stayed on through the night. There was no sleeping, only sitting upright on the boards, listening to the murmurs of thousands of women who had spent the last 7 years running from precisely this fate. After several days, the trains came. The destination wasn't shared. The journey south took the better part of a week, the carriages packed tight, and at the end of it the women were unloaded at the foot of the Pyrenees into a place called Gurs. It had been built in 1939 for refugees fleeing the Spanish Civil War, the Republicans who had retreated north as Franco's forces closed in. Now it held a different kind of refugee. The barracks sat on swampland. The mud rose to the ankles and never quite dried. Dysentery moved through the wooden huts, and typhoid too. The daily ration was a watery soup and a piece of bread that had to be broken with both hands. The women had been imprisoned by the very republic that had once offered them shelter. The German army was pushing south. Suicides began to multiply in the barracks. And it was there, in that mud, that Hannah and the others made what she later described as a deliberate choice to answer the question of whether to live or die. Reading groups formed. They debated Clausewitz, the great Prussian strategist of the previous century, whose book On War they pored over to make sense of the catastrophe outside the wire. They had no word of their husbands, no word of their mothers. Only the swamp, the soup, and the cold logic of military theory. In June, France collapsed. An armistice was signed with Nazi Germany, and one clause in particular made the camp at Gurs a death trap. The French authorities had agreed to surrender, on demand, any German refugees the Gestapo cared to ask for. Before the new Vichy regime, the puppet government that would administer the southern half of the country, could fully consolidate, there was a window of bureaucratic confusion. The guards drifted away from their posts. A brief, ambiguous order allowed women with liberation papers to leave, though almost no one had such papers. Hannah obtained forged ones. She walked out the front gate. 200 women, out of thousands, did the same. She later wrote, with chilling plainness, that they knew the majority of those who remained behind would die. They did. They were handed to the Germans and sent to Auschwitz. She walked. She hitchhiked. The roads were choked with millions of displaced French families, abandoned cars, rumors of German patrols moving up from somewhere unseen. She made her way toward Montauban, in the unoccupied zone, a gathering point for those still trying to find a way out. And then, on a crowded street in that small town, the most improbable thing in a collapsing world, she looked up and saw her husband Heinrich walking toward her. He had escaped his own camp in the chaos of the defeat. They found each other by accident in a country that no longer worked. With Hannah's mother, Martha, they made their way to Marseille, the last port, the last bottleneck, the city of forged documents and shadowy hotel rooms. There they found Varian Fry, the American journalist running a small clandestine operation called the Emergency Rescue Committee out of a hotel suite. Bribing officials and smuggling the intellectuals of Europe out from under the noses of the Vichy police, he secured them American emergency visas. But that was only the first hurdle. They still needed exit permits to legally leave France and transit visas to cross Spain and Portugal, a tangle of stamps and signatures that could take months to assemble. During the long wait, Hannah spent her days with Walter Benjamin. He was exhausted, nervous, terrified of capture, and he carried a black briefcase with him everywhere. He would not put it down. Inside was a manuscript he said was more important than his own life. When his chance came to cross the Pyrenees in September, 4 months before the others could follow, he left a copy of the manuscript with Hannah. It was called Theses on the Philosophy of History. He made the climb on foot to the Spanish border town of Portbou, arriving exhausted. The guards, working under newly changed orders, refused to honor his transit visa. They told him he would be sent back to France in the morning. That night, in a small hotel above the sea, Walter Benjamin took enough morphine to end his life. The next day, the guards reversed their decision, and the rest of his party was waved through. She received the news in Marseille. The thing she could do, the only thing, was carry his pages out of Europe. Inside them were his theses on the philosophy of history, and inside the theses was the image that would haunt the rest of the century, the angel of history, drawn from a small Paul Klee painting Benjamin had owned and stared at for years, an angel with its face turned toward the past, its wings caught in a storm blowing out of paradise, watching the wreckage rise and being blown helplessly into a future it could not see. In early 1941, they climbed the mountains he had climbed, crossed Franco's Spain, and reached Lisbon. The city was strange, brightly lit, untouched by blackout, full of people staring out at the Atlantic. They waited 3 months. In May, they boarded the SS Guinée, a Portuguese ship that crossed the ocean while U-boats prowled beneath it. And on the 22nd of May, 1941, the ship docked in New York. She was 34. She had no English, no job, no home. In her pocket was $25 from the Zionist Organization of America, the network that helped newly arrived Jewish refugees find their feet. In her luggage was a manuscript that belonged to a dead friend. Out of all of it, the velodrome, the camp, the mud, the friend on the border, she had begun to see something that would later become the spine of her first great book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. She had learned, by living it, that the rights of man are not written into the air. A human being, stripped of a country, she would write, is a human being stripped of the right to have rights at all. We lost our home, she would later put it, which means the familiarity of daily life. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the simplicity of gestures, the unaffected expression of feelings. And so, in a harbour she did not know, in a language she could not yet speak, she stepped off the boat and began. Chapter 6. New York, the Aufbau newspaper, and building a life from nothing. The boat docked in May of 1941. Hannah stepped onto American soil with little more than the clothes she wore and a head full of German philosophy. The language ahead of her was a wall. To climb it, she spent 2 months in Massachusetts as a housekeeper for a kindly family, scrubbing floors and listening, until the strange sounds began to settle into sense. By summer's end, she could read an English newspaper. By winter, she could write in it. The apartment they found on West 95th Street in Manhattan was small, dim, and a little tired around the edges. 3 adults would share its rooms for the next 7 years. Hannah, her husband, and her mother. Martha was demanding, old-fashioned, and quietly disappointed. Heinrich, ever the brilliant and self-taught man, took whatever work he could find. For a time, he shoveled chemicals in a New Jersey factory, hours of grueling physical labor that left him exhausted. His sorrow, Hannah would later describe, was a melancholy that had broken open at the revelation of the gas chambers, and he carried it the way some men carry a limp. And yet, in the middle of all this, Hannah began to write. The German Jewish émigré weekly newspaper Aufbau gave her a column, and the voice that emerged on its pages was not the patient voice of the philosopher. It was sharp, it was furious, it made demands. She insisted that Jews must stop waiting to be rescued, that they must form their own army, that they must fight as Jews against those who hunted them as Jews. By 1944, this thinking had hardened into an essay called Zionism Reconsidered. She sent it to the magazine Commentary. It sat in a drawer for months before an editor returned it, warning that a malicious reader might twist her words. The essay found a home eventually in the Menora Journal, where it landed like a stone through a window. She accused the Jewish leadership of betraying the very people it claimed to lead, and she warned that a Jewish state, born without partners and without a wider federation, would survive only as what she called a sphere of interest between greater powers, forever testing the patience of its neighbors. Then, in September of 1945, a small miracle occurred. An American military correspondent traveling through Heidelberg mentioned her name in passing to an old professor. A letter soon crossed the Atlantic. Karl Jaspers, her teacher from the Heidelberg years, had survived. He wrote of the long sorrow of imagining her dead. She wrote back at once, telling him that knowing he had come through the hellish spectacle unharmed made the world feel just a little like home again. Packages of coffee and clothing and food began to move eastward. A philosophical lifeline, severed by 12 years of catastrophe, was carefully retied. The politics, though, would not leave her alone. As Britain prepared to withdraw from Palestine in 1948, Hannah threw herself into one last public plea. In an essay titled "To Save the Jewish Homeland," she sided with Judah Magnus and his small Ikud party, who argued for a single binational state in which Jews and Arabs would share power through mixed local councils. It was an unpopular vision, growing more unpopular by the day. American Jews, she observed with bitter astonishment, had suddenly united behind revisionist Zionism, the right-wing nationalist faction that demanded a sovereign Jewish state at any cost. Left-wing intellectuals, businessmen, philanthropists, Yiddish press readers, all of them now spoke with one voice. To Hannah, this was not agreement. It was, she wrote, the expression of fanaticism and hysteria. When Magnus died that October, she felt her political isolation as something close to physical. Politics in our century, she confessed to a friend, had become almost a business of despair. That same summer brought a private grief alongside the public one. Martha, now 74, boarded the Queen Mary for England. Telegrams chased one another across the ocean, asthma attacks on board. Then, on the 27th of July, death in her sleep. What Hannah felt was tangled, equal parts mourning and the guilty unburdening that comes when a difficult love finally rests. Heinrich was less gentle in his diagnosis. Hitler and Stalin, he said, had done more than saddle them with her mother. In August of 1949, Hannah sailed back to a Europe she had fled. She went on behalf of the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Project, helping to recover books and ritual objects looted by the Nazis. Germany itself was a strange country to her now. The cities were being rebuilt with furious, almost mechanical energy, and beneath the rubble she sensed a sullen refusal to look at what had happened. In Basel, she sat with Jaspers and his wife Gertrude, and for the first time the three of them crossed into the intimate German du, the familiar form reserved for family and the dearest of friends. The shift of a single pronoun, in German, can carry the weight of a vow. Chapter 7. The Origins of Totalitarianism. For nearly a decade, Hannah had been working on a book. It had begun in Paris, before the camps, even before the flight to Lisbon. She had carried its early pages across the Atlantic in 1941. Now, in 1949, the manuscript sailed back across the Atlantic yet again, tucked into her trunk, and the work of finishing it began in earnest. It was a strange object, this book. The more she wrote, the more it refused to behave like a normal history book. There were no neat chronologies, no tidy cause and effect chains marching from one decade to the next. Instead, she structured the whole thing into three vast pillars: anti-Semitism, imperialism, and then, finally, totalitarianism itself. The first pillar set out to do something startling. It refused the idea that hatred of Jews was some ancient mystical curse stretching back through the centuries. She wanted to look at it as a political phenomenon, a thing born of the 19th century nation-state. She traced how the aristocracy, the petty bourgeoisie, and at last the rootless mob had turned their fury upon Jewish populations who had lost their old political function while still carrying the visible weight of financial wealth. It was a thesis that made plenty of people uncomfortable, and she knew it would. There was a darker observation buried in those early pages, too. A strange psychological alliance, she argued, had bound together the intellectual elite and the social mob. What held them together was a shared, almost gleeful disgust for bourgeois hypocrisy. The writers and the artists had looked at the mob's wild beliefs and seen only the absence of respectability, ignoring entirely what those beliefs actually contained. It was an unsettling thing to write. And in 1948, while she was still pouring her energy into these pages, her mother Martha died of an asthma attack aboard the Queen Mary somewhere on the open sea between New York and England. The grief landed hard. There had been years of strain between them in the cramped apartment, and now there was guilt mingled with the loss. Heinrich, dark-humoured as ever, remarked that Hitler and Stalin had not been the only ones to saddle them with Martha's demanding, sponge-like love. Somehow, in the aftermath, his own post-war paralysis broke. The two of them began working together, husband and wife, in a way they hadn't before, debating and refining pages back and forth, a fierce dual monarchy of the mind. The second pillar took her gaze far away from Europe. The true laboratory of total domination, she argued, had been the colonial frontier. Africa, India, the places where European adventurers and administrators had wandered free of the legal and moral fences that hemmed them in back home. She called it the phantom world of the Dark Continent, where armed colonizers had escaped what they understood as civilization and looked at native populations as something less than human, ghost-like, unreal. There, the dual techniques of race thinking and bureaucratic rule had been pioneered. Human beings had been turned into natural resources, things to be managed. And then, she warned, the methods had boomeranged. The machinery of treating people as superfluous masses had eventually been carried back across the Mediterranean, back into Europe itself. The final section was the one that would make the most enemies. Nazism and Stalinism, she argued, were structurally symmetrical. Two faces of an entirely new and monstrous form of government, unlike any tyranny the world had seen before. The old tyrants had wanted power over men. These regimes wanted something else. They wanted to make men superfluous. The camps, she wrote, were ghastly laboratories built to test the hypothesis that everything is possible. Places where the juridical person was stripped away first, then the moral person, then the last flickers of individual identity, until what remained was a uniform bundle of biological reactions. She theorized this rule as resting on two interlocking mechanisms: terror, which was the physical essence of the thing, and ideology, which slipped inside the head and did the rest. Ordinary laws, she wrote, had always worked like fences, protecting a stable common world. Totalitarianism leveled those fences and put in their place what she called laws of movement, race war, class struggle, endless processes through which the forces of nature or history could race freely through mankind. Terror stabilized men so that those forces could move. Ideology, meanwhile, freed thought from the rough texture of lived experience, offering a logically deduced substitute for reality. Quoting Martin Luther, she noted that the lonely man always deduces one thing from the other and thinks everything to the worst. That loneliness was the soil, not solitude, which was the healthy quiet of the inner dialogue, but a deeper thing, the experience of not belonging to the world at all. The uprooted modern masses, cut loose from neighborhood and trade and shared reality, were primed for the airtight logic of ideology. Some clashes arrived even before the book reached the shelves. Eric Vogelin, the prominent political philosopher of the day, dug in hard against her, insisting that human nature could not be altered, that to suggest otherwise was itself a symptom of Western collapse. She refused him the comfort of eternal essences. Historically, she replied, we know human nature only insofar as it exists. She reached back to Immanuel Kant for help, dusting off his concept of radical evil, the inherent corruption by which humans place self-interest above the moral law, and bending it toward the industrialized nightmares of her own century. What radical evil really was, she admitted, she didn't know. It had something to do with making human beings, as human beings, superfluous. The book came out in 1951 under the title The Origins of Totalitarianism, the same year she finally received United States citizenship after 18 long, precarious years of statelessness. The first print run sold out fast. She woke up famous, more or less. The mid-century left, still loyal to the old anti-fascist Popular Front that had once united socialists and communists and liberals against Hitler, was furious at the structural equation of Stalin's Soviet Union with Hitler's Reich. They accused her of weaponizing history for the emerging Cold War. She did not retract. And yet, even in the noise of her sudden celebrity, a quieter dissatisfaction was already setting in. She had diagnosed how the public realm could be annihilated. She had not yet shown how a public realm was built. The loneliness she had named, so precisely pointed somewhere, her book had not gone. Toward the foundations of Western political life itself, toward the long, slow elevation of biological necessity and the laboring process above everything else. There was a companion study she had been planning, something tracking what she considered the totalitarian elements hidden inside orthodox Marxism, the rigorous economic doctrine descending from Marx himself rather than the looser communist movements of her century. That little study would not stay little for long. Chapter 8: The Human Condition and the Vita Activa. The spring of 1952 brought Hannah a piece of news that would shape the rest of her thinking life. The John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation had awarded her a generous grant. With it came something she had rarely known since leaving Germany: time, money, a long, unbroken stretch in which to think. The proposal she had submitted spoke of a study into the totalitarian elements within Marxism, and she set about the work with the seriousness of someone who knew the question mattered. It would be a misreading to imagine her motivated by some crude hostility to the left. The opposite was true. She had watched with a kind of grieving intelligence as the political idealism of an entire tradition had been bent and warped into the bureaucratic horrors of Stalinism, and she wanted to understand how such a thing could happen. How a doctrine born of compassion for the laboring poor had been twisted into camps and show trials and the wholesale treatment of human beings as so much raw material to be hammered into shape. The puzzle, as she turned it over in her mind, was a delicate one. The flaw, she came to believe, did not lie in Marx's analysis of capitalism, which she continued to respect as a tool of extraordinary sharpness. The flaw lay deeper, woven into the broader inheritance of Western philosophy itself. It was the old idea that political action might be understood as a kind of fabrication, a making, as though the world of human affairs could be hammered into shape the way a carpenter shapes a chair. Marxism, she would write, could be developed into a totalitarian ideology because of its perversion or misunderstanding of political action as the making of history. There is an old revolutionary saying, often repeated and rarely examined, that you cannot make an omelette without breaking eggs. Hannah pored over this phrase with a kind of fascinated horror. Under Stalin, she saw the breaking had become everything. The omelette had vanished from view. What remained was only the violence of the breaking itself, justified by an appeal to the grand machinery of history. Totalitarianism, she concluded, had simply drawn the final, the most unrestrained consequences from certain heritages which had become predicaments. and yet something in her own thinking remained close to Marx, closer perhaps than her critics ever realized. Her vision of the human being as a creature who creates a world through activity owed a real debt to the young Marx of the 1844 manuscripts. With their humanist warmth and their insistence on the dignity of making, the project that began as a critique was slowly becoming something else, something larger. A complete philosophical excavation of human activity itself. She decided to map what the old philosophers had called the Vita Activa, the active life, and to set it against the tradition's long preference for the Vita Contemplativa, the contemplative life, the life of the mind withdrawn from worldly affairs. For centuries, the thinkers had ranked contemplation above action. Hannah meant to turn that hierarchy on its head. The working title she gave the manuscript was Amor Mundi, for love of the world. A title that revealed everything about what she hoped to do, which was to reclaim the earthly, public realm from the wreckage of totalitarianism and from the loneliness of modern consumer life. The book she eventually wrote rested on a tripartite division of human activity: labor, work, and action. Each one corresponded to a fundamental condition of being human. Labor, she wrote, was the inescapable biological process of the body itself. With its growth and metabolism and slow decay, the human condition of labor is life itself. A rhythm of exhaustion and regeneration that leaves nothing behind, that produces nothing lasting, where the result of effort is almost as quickly consumed as the effort is spent. She gave this figure a name borrowed from the Old Latin, animal laborians, the laboring animal. The human being reduced entirely to the cycle of working and consuming, with nothing remaining at the end. Think of the worker who clocks in, earns a wage, spends it on food and rent and entertainment, and clocks in again the next morning. The wheel turns, but nothing is built, nothing is left behind. And she issued a warning that still feels startling to read. The modern age had made this kind of life mere survival, dressed up in a paycheck, the highest thing a person could aspire to. And here was the trap. We had built a civilization that worshipped work, just as the machines were beginning to take the work away. A society of laborers, she said, with no labor left to do. Surely nothing could be worse. Work was something different. For Arendt, labor was what you do to stay alive, the cooking, the cleaning, the earning. It disappears the moment it's done. Work was what you do to leave something behind. Work belonged to Homo faber, man the maker, the carpenter, the architect, the writer, who builds things that last, a table, a house, a book, objects that outlive their maker and give us a stable world to inhabit. But work had its own danger. To build the table, you have to kill the tree. The maker treats his materials as raw stuff to be cut and shaped. And when politicians start thinking the same way, when they look at a society and see only raw material to be hammered into shape, you get tyrants who treat human beings as lumber. Action was the highest of the three, and the most fragile. Action was what happens when human beings step forward and reveal who they are through words and deeds. A speech in a town hall, or a protest in the street, even founding a movement, or telling the truth when it costs you something. Unlike labor, which is forgotten, and work, which produces objects, action produces stories. It depended on plurality, she said, on the fact that we are all human, and yet no two of us are ever quite the same. Action was the answer given to the oldest question asked of every newcomer to the world. Who are you? She drew a sharp distinction between the public realm where action takes place under the bright light of shared appearance, and the private realm, which she defended with surprising fierceness. The public realm was the arena of speech, debate, and great deeds, where you were seen by your fellow citizens and judged by them. The private realm was the home, the four walls behind which you could simply be without being watched. A life spent entirely in public, she wrote, becomes shallow because there is no hidden self left to draw from, only the performance. The private home, the four walls, the dark ground from which we rise into visibility, was not a capitalist trinket, but a moral necessity. And the modern age, she diagnosed, was suffering from the cancerous rise of something she called the social, a hybrid realm that blurred the old boundaries. In the ancient world, politics was the arena where citizens argued about how to live together, and the household was where you managed the daily business of staying alive. The social, she said, had collapsed these two and turned politics into housekeeping on a national scale. Against the doom of grand historical processes, against the shadow of the bomb, she offered one final concept: natality. The simple, miraculous fact that new human beings are continually being born into the world, the miracle that saves the world, she wrote, the realm of human affairs from its normal, natural ruin, is ultimately the fact of natality. Every birth was an infinite improbability. Every newcomer carried the possibility of beginning something no one had foreseen, and so totalitarianism could never finally win. The manuscript was published in 1958 by the University of Chicago Press under a title chosen by the publisher rather than the author, The Human Condition. It made her name across the world. No longer merely the woman who had explained totalitarianism, she was now spoken of as one of the original political thinkers of the 20th century. Some of the ideas in the book had in fact been tested years earlier, in the autumn of 1953, when Princeton had invited her to deliver the Christian Gauss seminars in criticism. And in 1959, the university came calling again, this time to make her the first woman in its long history to be appointed to a full professorship. The press swarmed. Photographers chased her across the campus. She found the whole spectacle unbearable. To be paraded as the first woman, as a biological curiosity in tweed, felt like a grotesque inversion of everything she had just written about the dignity of public appearance. She complained bitterly, in private, of being treated like a monkey in a cage. The irony was bottomless. Here she was, lecturing on the necessity of a pluralistic public space inside an institution that had spent centuries keeping women out of that very space. It would harden in her a lifelong suspicion of identity politics and an insistence, stubborn to the end, that she be judged only by her words and her deeds. But the categories she had built in those Guggenheim years were about to be tested in the open air of American life. Federal troops were marching down a street in Arkansas, escorting 9 black children, the Little Rock Nine, past screaming crowds and into a segregated high school. And Hannah, watching from her desk in New York, was already sharpening her pen for an essay that would bring her some of the bitterest controversy of her life. Chapter 9. Little Rock and the American Question. The image came over the wires in September of 1957, and it would not let her go. A 15-year-old girl, in a crisp black and white dress, dark sunglasses fixed on her face, walking toward the doors of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Her name was Elizabeth Eggford. Around her surged a mob of white adults and teenagers, faces contorted, mouths open mid-shout. The girl walked alone. She carried her schoolbooks. The crowd pressed in from every side, and there was no one beside her, no parent, no protector, nothing between her body and that wall of noise. Hannah saw the photograph in her apartment in New York, and something in her gave way. It wasn't an American memory that surfaced. It was a European one. She thought of Jewish children in the 1930s walking past the same kind of crowd in Berlin or Vienna, their parents standing helpless on the pavement, unable to shield them. The girl in the photograph was, to her eye, a child sent out to do what adults had failed to do themselves. And Hannah, who had spent years trying to understand how the political world could turn so violent so quickly, sat down at her desk to write. The essay was commissioned by Commentary magazine. The editors expected a sturdy liberal endorsement of the desegregation effort, the kind of piece that would sit comfortably alongside the rest of their coverage. What arrived on their desks was something else entirely. They held the manuscript for months. They argued over it. They commissioned the philosopher Sidney Hook, a long-standing voice on the Democratic left, to write a critical rebuttal that would run alongside the piece. Hannah, learning of this, withdrew the essay. Hook was furious. He went on the attack, accusing her publicly of having pulled the article because she had lost her nerve and could not face his critique. Eventually, the socialist journal Dissent agreed to print it in the winter of 1959, attaching an editorial note that gently but firmly distanced the magazine from its author's conclusions. The piece was called Reflections on Little Rock, and the argument inside it ran something like this. The federal government, Hannah said, had used a political hammer to fix a social problem, and in doing so had reached into a sphere where it had no business reaching. A school, she argued, was an extension of society. It was where children were prepared for the social world. And the social world, for Hannah, was the sphere in which people exercised the right to associate with whomever they pleased and to exclude whomever they pleased. Discrimination, in her vocabulary, was not yet a dirty word in that sphere. It was the basic texture of social life. So where, then, should the civil rights movement be fighting? Here she pounced. The NAACP, she wrote, had aimed at the wrong targets. The real obscenity was not the segregated school. The real obscenity was the anti-miscegenation laws that still sat on the books in 29 states, laws that forbade a black man and a white woman, a black woman and a white man from marrying. Those, she insisted, were a violent infringement of the most elementary political right a citizen could possess, the right to marry whoever one wished. Strike those laws down first, she said. And the buses, the trains, the hotels and restaurants in the business districts of southern towns. These were public services, she wrote, places where all citizens stood equal, and the segregation enforced inside them was every bit as scandalous as the laws that policed the bedroom. She could not understand why the civil rights movement had not begun there with the public sphere, instead of marching its children into the schoolyard. And then she came to the children, to the 15-year-old Elizabeth on that pavement in that dress. Hannah's reaction was visceral and unsparing. The girl, she wrote, had been asked to be a hero, and that was something neither her absent father nor the equally absent representatives of the NAACP had felt called upon to be themselves. Adults, she insisted, fought political battles. Adults did not place those battles on the small shoulders of their daughters. And then she went further. She projected herself into the mind of a black mother in the American South, and she wrote a sentence that would haunt her. If I were a Negro mother in the South, she said, I would feel that the Supreme Court ruling had put my child into a more humiliating position than the one she'd been in before. I would not have the right, she wrote, to deprive my child of a childhood in order to exercise my political rights. The reaction was swift and severe. American liberals accused her of arrogance, of a stunning emotional blindness, of an elitist European inability to see what segregation actually was on the ground. Underneath the outrage sat a deeper failure. She had taken the European Jewish story, with its long argument about assimilation and social prejudice, and pressed it onto the American South. Jim Crow was not a matter of social etiquette. It was a violent, legally enforced regime of terror, of economic strangulation, of state-sanctioned murder. The line between a social school and a political law dissolved the moment you stood on a Mississippi road at night. For years, she defended the essay. She would not retract. Then, in 1965, the novelist Ralph Ellison sat for an interview with the Southern poet Robert Penn Warren and was asked about her piece. Ellison answered with sociological precision. The author, he said, had absolutely no conception of what went on in the minds of Negro parents when they sent their children through those lines of hostile people. The black child in the South was being guided through a brutal rite of passage, trained to face the mob, to hold the terror, to claim a citizenship the country had spent generations denying. The exposure was bound, Ellison said, to the ideal of sacrifice, a long historical tradition within black American life, in which the body of the child was offered up so that the future of the people might be secured. Hannah read the interview, and the structure she had defended for years simply gave way. She sat down and wrote to Ellison directly, a letter astonishing in its plainness. "You are entirely right," she said. "It is precisely this ideal of sacrifice which I didn't understand. I was wrong, and you are right. I simply didn't understand the situation." It was an admission almost without precedent in her published life. The lesson left a mark. A framework she had carried out of the wreckage of Europe had failed to grasp the country she now lived in, and the failure asked something of her, a renewed willingness to see events as they actually appeared. Before theory rushed in to name them, that hard lesson arrived just in time. In Buenos Aires, on a darkening street, agents of the Israeli Mossad were closing in on a former SS officer named Adolf Eichmann. They would lift him into a car, smuggle him out of Argentina, and deliver him to a courtroom in Jerusalem. And Hannah, freshly humbled, would board a plane to watch him sit inside a glass booth and to write down exactly what she saw there. Chapter 10. Eichmann in Jerusalem. The building was called Beit Ha'am, the House of the People, a cultural center in West Jerusalem that had been hastily converted into a courtroom. Bulletproof glass had been fitted around a small booth at the front. Police lined the walls. Survivors filled the witness benches, and their testimony, day after day, weighted the air with something that could almost be touched. Hannah sat in the press gallery, having flown in on assignment for the New Yorker, scribbling furious notes. The whole world had come to see a monster. What she saw, instead, was the man inside the booth. He was middle-aged, slender, with thinning hair and teeth that didn't quite fit his mouth. He squinted through nearsighted eyes. He sneezed. He twitched. He listened to the proceedings with the slightly anxious attention of a clerk worried about a missed memo. This was Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat who had organized the deportation of millions across a continent, and there was nothing diabolical about him at all. He looked, Hannah thought, like the sort of man you might pass on a tram without noticing. And it was in that gap, between the enormity of the deeds and the smallness of the doer, that a phrase began to form in her mind: the banality of evil. The phrase has been misunderstood ever since. She did not mean the evil was small. She did not mean that Eichmann was an innocent cog turning helplessly in some great machine. What she meant was something stranger and more troubling. This particular man, who had moved trains and timetables and human beings towards their deaths with quite remarkable efficiency, was characterized above all by thoughtlessness. And by thinking, Hannah did not mean intelligence. Eichmann was not stupid. She meant something much more specific. Thinking, for her, was the silent dialogue you carry on with yourself, the inner voice that asks, "Is what I am doing right? Could I live with myself if I did this?" It is the ability to step outside your own role for a moment and see your actions through another person's eyes. Eichmann could not do this. He could not, it seemed, think from another person's standpoint. He could barely think from his own. She listened closely to how he spoke, and what she heard was a kind of armor. Eichmann spoke almost entirely in clichés, in stock phrases and bureaucratic formulas, in the hollow slogans of his vanished regime. He had what she would call language rules, an inability to leave the cliché behind, even when describing the most monstrous things. The clichés did the thinking for him. They sealed him off from reality, from the actual human beings on the other end of his timetables, and from any inner voice that might have asked him to stop. At the foot of the gallows, he reached for the platitudes of a funeral parlor and seemed entirely unaware that anything was odd about this. The inability to imagine another's reality was total. And that, she came to believe, was the very mechanism by which the administration of genocide had been made possible on a continental scale. Not monsters, not fanatics. Men who had stopped thinking and let the clichés carry them. What she refused to do, and what later readers so often wished she had done, was turn Eichmann into a symbol. She would not make him a stand-in for the authoritarian personality, or for some Eichmann lurking within each one of us. That, she thought, was a kind of narcissism dressed up as conscience. It was easier to worry about an abstract perpetrator than to look at this specific man and his specific deeds. The desire for a representative villain might comfort us, but it does violence to the particularity of what actually happened. And then there was the harder matter, the one that would cost her almost everything. She had read the documents carefully. She had seen how, across occupied Europe, the Jewish councils, the leaders of Jewish communities under Nazi rule, had been drawn into the machinery of destruction. They had compiled lists of names and property. They had collected money from the deportees to pay for the trains that carried them away. They had kept records of vacated apartments. They had supplied marshals to help load the carriages. She wrote it down as she had found it, and she drew a conclusion that has been argued over ever since, that had the Jewish people been wholly unorganized and leaderless, there would have been chaos and misery, but the final number of dead would not have reached the figure it did. The 5-part series ran in The New Yorker in early 1963. The book followed, and the storm that broke around her was unlike anything she had known. Factual truth, she would later write, carries a kind of stubbornness that makes people hate it. It refuses to soften. It will not be argued out of existence. A propaganda lie, as she called it, took hold almost overnight, that she had exonerated Eichmann by calling him banal and had blamed the Jews for their own slaughter. The most painful letter came from Gershom Scholem, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism and her friend of 3 decades. He published an open letter accusing her of a heartless, sneering tone of writing without love for her own people. He said he regarded her wholly as a daughter of our people. Her reply has become famous. She told him he was quite right. She had never loved any people or collective, not the Germans, not the French, not the Americans, not the working class. She loved her friends, and that was the only kind of love she knew. To be called a daughter of her people, she wrote back, would be like saying she was a man and not a woman, a kind of insanity. True devotion to one's people, she said, must always leave room for harsh criticism of them. The Anti-Defamation League, alongside B'nai B'rith, the venerable Jewish service organization, circulated pamphlets denouncing the book across America and Europe. Old friendships shuttered one after another. The philosopher Hans Jonas, a friend since Marburg, broke with her and would not be reconciled. Even Kurt Blumenfeld, her old Zionist mentor who had guided her into political life in the 1930s, lay dying in Israel as the storm broke. When she came to see him for the last time, she explained how her critics were misreading the book, and he agreed with her that one of the hostile reviewers in Aufbau was a fool and another an idiot, though the conversation could not undo the gulf the controversy had opened between her and so much of the Jewish world. In a letter to Jaspers, she wrote a sentence that sounds almost weary. "I believe that the war between the Jews and me is over." She made one public gesture of solidarity. In 1964, she appeared on German television beside the playwright Rolf Hochhuth, whose play The Deputy, exposing the silence of Pope Pius XII during the Holocaust, had drawn a near-identical campaign of denunciation. The same machinery, she saw, was at work in both cases, the old habit of attacking the messenger in order to leave the message undisturbed. By late 1964, she was preparing to take up a teaching post at the University of Chicago. The controversy still smoldered, and it would smolder for the rest of her life. But the stance had been taken. The truth-teller, she had come to think, must stand a little outside the community of peers and pay the cost of doing so. That distrust of group sentiment, of any politics rooted in tribal loyalty or in the evasion of awkward facts, would not leave her now. If human beings were neither monsters nor cogs, then the question of how they might actually generate freedom together, freely and in concert, became more pressing than ever. And so her gaze, scoured by what she had seen in Jerusalem, began to turn backwards and westwards, across the Atlantic, towards a fragile and almost forgotten experiment in public freedom, and the lost treasure that she believed lay buried inside it. Chapter 11. On Revolution and the Lost Treasure. In the spring of 1963, while the magazine installments from Jerusalem were still landing on doormats across America and Europe, another book of hers slipped into the world. It was called On Revolution, and under almost any other circumstances it would have been the literary event of her year, but the Eichmann storm had already taken the air out of the room. Reviewers who might have engaged with her political theory were busy arguing about her account of a man in a glass booth. The book, dense with thought and long in the making, arrived to a kind of distracted reception, half overheard above the noise. She had worked on it with great care. The proofs had gone to her husband at their apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and Heinrich had written back with something close to reverence. He told her it was, in his estimation, her best book, clear, balanced, politically wise, and if it landed, he believed it would land for a long time. The dedication went to Karl Jaspers in Basel, her old teacher, who saw something in it that other readers would miss. He wrote to her of its underlying sadness, telling her it stood beside her work on totalitarianism, perhaps even above it, and that the whole of it was, at heart, her vision of a tragedy that somehow did not let her despair. And it was a tragedy she was telling, a comparative one, laid out like two patients on a table: the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Two great upheavals of the 18th century, both reaching for something new, only one of which managed to plant a lasting political form in the ground. The Americans, she argued, had been engaged in something rare and precious. They had been founding. They had spent themselves on the slow, deliberate construction of a framework, a constitution, in which freedom might actually live. The French had set out towards something similar, and then the streets of Paris had filled. The starving had come up out of the cellars and the back alleys, and what she called the social question had swallowed the revolution whole. That phrase, the social question, meant the sheer, crushing weight of mass poverty and economic want, the bodies that needed feeding before they could think about freedom. Once that question entered the political square, she said, the revolution stopped being about founding a free polity and began being about easing biological necessity, and from that pivot, terror followed. It was, she knew, an uncomfortable argument and a deeply anti-Marxist one. She was suggesting that trying to solve poverty through political revolution tended again and again to devour the very freedom the revolution had been called into existence to create. She drew a hard line between the political and the social, between freedom and necessity. Expropriation, the seizing of property and land, once unleashed, did not, she warned, stop where its theorists imagined. Only legal and political institutions, standing apart from economic forces, could hold back what she called the inherently monstrous potentialities of that process. Freedom, in her telling, was not free enterprise. It was not the freedom to be left alone, nor the freedom to own more things than your neighbor. She had little patience for the idea that political freedom resembled the difference between the owner of 2 cars and the owner of none. Freedom, for her, was the active, ongoing participation in public affairs. It was something you did with others, in the open air of a shared world. The academics were not charmed. Marxist historians complained about her indifference to class and economics. One British historian remarked that scholars were irritated by what he called her preference for metaphysical construction and poetic feeling over mere facts. A political scientist accused her of imprecision and narrowness in her very definition of revolution. A socialist critic, writing for a downtown New York weekly, admired the later chapters and bristled at her rejection of the social question. Another dismissed the whole project as nostalgic conservatism, vibrating, he said, with longing for an agrarian society of free peasants and articulate town councillors. And yet, buried inside the book, there was something the radical left could not quite let go of. She called it the lost treasure of the revolutionary tradition. She meant the council, the grassroots council. She traced it through the Parisian sections of 1789, those small neighborhood assemblies where ordinary people had gathered to argue and decide, and on through the Paris Commune of 1871, that short-lived, radical, socialist government that had briefly held the city. She followed it into the Russian Soviets of 1905 and 1917, Soviets being simply the Russian word for workers' councils springing up from below, the German workers' councils of 1918 and 1919, the Hungarian workers' councils of 1956. In every case, she observed, the councils had not been organized by professional revolutionaries or party cadres. They had appeared on their own, in the vacuum left by collapsing authority, as ordinary people gathered to govern themselves. And in every case, they had been crushed by centralized parties, by one-party states, by the machinery of terror. The tragedy of the modern revolutionary century, she wrote, was that this living council form had never been folded into a permanent constitutional foundation. The book was, in part, an attempt to rescue them from historical forgetting. She went back to the word revolution itself. Originally an astronomical term, she reminded her readers a turning, a cyclical return. Only in the late 18th century had it taken on its modern meaning of a genuine beginning, something unprecedented breaking into the world. A real revolution, she said, required two acts, the violent rebellion against oppression and the far harder labor of founding a new political space afterwards. To explain how such a space might endure, she reached back to the Roman idea of authority. Authority, she insisted, was something distinct from violence, distinct from coercion. In the American case, it had not been lodged in a king or in the will of the crowd, but in the Supreme Court and the Constitution, a continuous augmentation of the original act of founding. She was, by then, teaching seminars in which students offered her sociological definitions of politics as the struggle for dominance, and she pushed back without hesitation. To claim that her adopted country was the most powerful on earth because it owned the largest arsenal, she said, was to mistake violence for power. When a young student handed in a paper defining politics as a form of self-expression, she wrote in the margin that she did not doubt many people, especially the young, agreed with him, and that she certainly did not. By the middle and later 60s, the book finally found its readers. Students in democratic societies, on American and German campuses, carried it around in dog-eared paperback, reading it alongside Albert Camus' The Rebel, his famous essay on rebellion. Her recovery of the spontaneous council looked uncannily like their own talk of participatory democracy. Activists organizing in Brooklyn neighborhoods pointed to her pages as the inspiration for their grassroots projects. In 1967, after years of cross-country commuting between teaching posts in Chicago and California, with all the worry that distance brought as Heinrich's health faltered, she, at last, accepted a permanent position at the graduate faculty of the New School for Social Research in New York, a short subway ride from Riverside Drive. The exhausting travel ended. Her first seminar there was called Political Experience in the 20th Century, and it traced the life of an imagined person born at the turn of the century, walking through its darkest years. That settling into a New York classroom would prove a brief shelter. The arguments she had set out on the page about rebellion, about councils, about the difference between power and violence were about to walk in off the streets. Her students were already underlining the same passages they would soon shout from occupied buildings. Draft boards were being raided, the Vietnam War was deepening, and the Republic itself was sliding toward a crisis that would force her to think, in public and at speed, about what citizens owed to one another when the state itself had begun to bleed. Chapter 12. The Sixties. Students, Vietnam, Black Power. From Berkeley to Columbia, students started spilling out of lecture halls and into the open air, holding teach-ins that lasted past midnight, sitting on library steps with mimeographed pamphlets warm from the machine. They were arguing, voting, refusing. They were occupying buildings and running them for a few days at a time as small experiments in self-government. To Hannah, watching from her desk and from the windows of her cabs, it felt almost uncanny. The very forms she had been writing about, the spontaneous councils, the gathered citizens speaking and acting in concert, appeared to be walking out of her pages and into Sproul Plaza. Then the mood on the campuses began to sour. The hopeful chant gave way to harsher slogans, and the gentle improvisation of the early teach-ins hardened into something Hannah recognized with a sinking dread. The students were beginning to romanticize men with guns, Che Guevara in his beret, Mao in his tunic, distant revolutionaries flattened into posters and creeds. The talk turned, increasingly, to violence as a kind of cleansing fire, a way for the oppressed to remake themselves through the act of destroying the oppressor. In 1969, she answered, and she answered hard. The essay was called On Violence, and it pulled no punches. Her targets were not the foot soldiers, but the philosophers behind them. Jean-Paul Sartre in Paris, and through Sartre, the anti-colonial thinker Frantz Fanon, whose book The Wretched of the Earth had become a kind of scripture on the Algerian war and decolonization. Sartre, in his famous preface, had written that through violence the colonized man recreates himself. Fanon had written that to shoot down a European was to kill two birds with one stone, to destroy an oppressor and the man he oppressed at once. Hannah read these lines and was appalled. Power and violence, she insisted, were not the same thing. They were opposites. Power was what arose when human beings acted together, talked together, persuaded one another, agreed. It belonged to the plural, the public, the space of appearance. Violence was something else entirely. Violence required implements. It multiplied strength through weapons. And out of the barrel of a gun, she wrote, could grow the most effective command and the most instant obedience, but never, ever power. The movements that confused the two would end by destroying the very freedom they hoped to build. The same fierce distinctions caused her to stumble badly with the Black Power movement. The demands for separate Black Studies programs, for separate dormitories, for a militant rhetoric of self-definition, struck her old categories the wrong way. She read them through the same uncompromising lens she had once turned on the desegregation crisis in Little Rock, separating the political realm of equality from the social realm she thought should be left alone. It was a blind spot, and a deep one, and it carried her past what was actually being asked. And yet, on Vietnam, she was unwavering. In her essay on civil disobedience, she defended the protesters with the full weight of her thinking. The civil disobedient, she argued, was not a criminal. The criminal slipped into the shadows for private gain. The civil disobedient stood in the daylight, in concert with others, openly refusing a law he believed unjust. The young men burning draft cards on courthouse steps were practicing the old American art of voluntary association, the very habit that Alexis de Tocqueville, the 19th century French author of Democracy in America, had once marveled at on his travels. When the Pentagon Papers spilled into print, she wrote, "Lying in politics," and her scalpel came out. The men running the war, the problem solvers with their game theory and their body counts and their charts, had built themselves a sealed little universe in which facts that did not flatter the policy were simply set aside. They had lied to the public, yes, but more disturbingly, they had lied to themselves. The educated technocrat she saw could be just as world-destroying as the totalitarian clerk. And then, on a Sunday in October of 1970, her husband had a massive heart attack in the Riverside Drive apartment. He was gone. 30 years. The bottom dropped out of the world, she told her friend Mary McCarthy, the American novelist who was perhaps the closest person she had left. The smoky kitchen fell silent. The books on the shelves were suddenly his books. She kept the schedule going because the schedule was the only thing holding her upright. She taught her classes at the new school. She gave her lectures. She walked through the grey hours and came home to the empty rooms. By 1972, sitting among his library, surrounded by the physical evidence of a shared life of the mind, she began to feel a different pull. The political battles of the decade had exhausted her, and the unresolved question from Jerusalem had never really left. That terrible suspicion, that ordinary thoughtlessness, the failure to think at all, might be enough to enable atrocity. The life of action would have to be matched, now, by something else. She would have to turn, at last, after all these decades, back toward the inner theatre of the mind and prepare for the Gifford Lectures in Scotland, that most prestigious of philosophical invitations, where she would try to map the faculties she had so long set aside. Chapter 13. Thinking, Willing, Judging, the Final Work. In the spring of 1973, a 66-year-old Hannah boarded a transatlantic flight bound for Scotland. The toll of it would not be small. In May of 1974, a severe heart attack interrupted the Scottish journey, halting the lectures partway through, forcing her to confront the limits of her own mortality with the same directness she had brought to so much else. She confided to an old friend, around this time, that she had done her bit in politics, and from now on, she said, she was going to stick to philosophy. The decades of action, of essays and arguments and public storms, of standing in the arena and being shouted at by her enemies and her former friends alike, had given way to something older. Looking back at her own beginnings, at the Marburg seminars of her youth, she conceded that her early formation had implied already, even though she may not have known it, a non-commitment to the public. Philosophy, she said, is a solitary business. The project she carried into Aberdeen was conceived as a kind of architectural counterweight to her great work of 1958. The human condition had mapped, in painstaking detail, the active life, labor, work, and action. But it had left the inward life entirely unexplored. Now she meant to chart the other half. The new book would be called The Life of the Mind, and it would have 3 volumes, each devoted to one of the mind's autonomous activities: thinking, willing, judging. But the whole undertaking was haunted. The ghost in the glass booth in Jerusalem had never quite let her go. Adolf Eichmann, his startling shallowness, his terrible ordinariness, had forced upon her a question she could no longer set aside. Evil, she had come to believe, was never radical. It was only extreme. It possessed no depth, no demonic dimension. It could overgrow and lay waste the world precisely because it spread like a fungus on the surface. That was its banality. And from this came the question that drove the new work. What are we doing when we do nothing but think? Could it be that thought itself, the silent activity of the mind, was among the conditions that conditioned a person against doing evil? The first volume took up that question directly. On the title page, she placed a stark warning from Heidegger, her old teacher. Thinking does not bring knowledge as the sciences do. Thinking does not produce practical wisdom. It does not solve the riddle of the universe, nor endow us with the power to act. Thinking, she suggested, was an invisible withdrawal from the world of appearances, an endless process that produced no settled results. It was, in her favorite image, like Penelope's web. And here she was reaching for Homer's Odyssey, where Penelope, awaiting her wandering husband, wove a burial shroud by day and unpicked it by night to delay her suitors. Thought, in the same way, undid every morning what it had finished the night before. Her model here was Socrates, who himself has left no doctrine, no system, only the example of a conversation. Thinking, for Hannah, was the silent dialogue between me and myself, the two in one. This was where conscience was born. A person who committed murder, she wrote, was condemned to spend the rest of their life locked in dialogue with a murderer. Eichmann's catastrophic complicity, she now saw, lay in his absolute failure to begin that dialogue. He had no internal partner with whom to converse. The second volume turned to the will, that strange, future-facing faculty of the mind, the one that lets us begin. The will, she pointed out, was a surprisingly late discovery in Western thought. The Greeks did not really have it. It emerged through the Christian era, through Augustine, and through Duns Scotus, the obscure medieval theologian whose careful arguments helped give the will its philosophical home. Philosophers, on the whole, had despised it. The will smashed their love of necessity. It introduced contingency and spontaneity into a world they preferred to imagine as logical. But that very contingency, she argued, was precious. It was the mental organ of natality, that miraculous human capacity to interrupt the automatic processes of history with something genuinely new. The third volume was meant to bridge the gap. Judging would carry the solitary mind back into the shared world of human plurality. She built it not from a political treatise, but from a creative misreading of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment, a dense work from the 1790s in which Kant had tried to explain how we make claims of taste, why we say a painting is beautiful, and expect others to agree. Judging, she said, required an enlarged mentality. It worked through representative thinking, holding in your own mind the standpoints of people who are not in the room, imagining the world as it looks from where they stand. The more perspectives one could imaginatively hold, the more valid one's conclusions. It demanded the liberation from private interest, the willingness to set aside what you personally wanted and ask what could be said from many points of view at once. And it dealt not in truth, which carries an element of coercion. A truth, once proven, leaves no room for argument. It dealt instead in opinion, which moves discursively from place to place until it ascends towards some impartial generality, a view shared by many minds. Truthfulness, she wrote, was the acceptance of things as they are, and out of that acceptance arose judgment itself. What Isak Dinesen, the Danish storyteller, had called the day on which we would be privileged to view and review our lives. Then, on the evening of December the 4th, 1975, the apartment on Riverside Drive was warm with company. Friends had come for dinner. The plates had been cleared, a cigarette had been lit, and then, without warning, the heart attack came, and the life of the mind ceased. She was 69 years old. In the adjacent study, in the carriage of her typewriter, sat a single sheet of paper. It bore the title Judging and 2 epigraphs. The rest of the page was entirely blank. That blank page was the last sentence she did not finish. There were others. Judgments she had spent 40 years not delivering, names she had refused to speak with the full weight of what she knew. The hardest of those names belonged to one man, and to understand why, we have to go back to a small German city tucked against the edge of the Black Forest, and back to the winter of 1950. Chapter 14. Heidegger Again, and the Things She Wouldn't Say. That winter found her once again on that long, painful itinerary through the ruins of Europe, and somewhere along the way she made a detour to Freiburg. A grand old university city, the kind of place where scholars had been arguing about being and truth for centuries, and it was where Martin Heidegger still lived. They met at a hotel. The waiter called out his name in the dining room, and there he was, the man she had loved as an 18-year-old student in Marburg, the man whose rectorship at this very university in 1933 had aligned his lectern with the swastika, the man she had not seen in roughly a quarter century. She wrote to him days later, trying to capture what had happened in that dining room. "This evening and this morning," she said, "are a confirmation of a whole lifetime. As the waiter called out your name, it was as if time stood still." Time, of course, had done nothing of the sort. Heidegger went home that night and confessed the meeting and the affair to his wife Elfriede, who had not known. Elfriede's anti-Semitism was no secret, and never had been. She had worn her own Nazi convictions as openly as a brooch. Hannah returned to New York in March, but she came back. Over the next 2 years, every trip to Europe brought another visit to the Heidegger home in Freiburg, and between the visits, letters, roughly 70 of them. She even sat in on one of his seminars. And what developed across those visits was a strange and painful arrangement. The Jewish refugee who had documented the machinery of genocide, sitting in the parlor of the woman who had worn the party badge with pride, taking tea, enduring jealous outbursts. On June 5, 1952, Elfriede threw a fit after one of the visits, and Heidegger wrote to Hannah asking her not to come back and not to write again. He chose, in the end, domestic calm over the woman who had crossed an ocean to forgive him. And the forgiveness itself was the strangest thing of all, because in April of 1933, this same man had been elected rector of the University of Freiburg by unanimous vote. He had aligned the institution with the Nazi state immediately, negotiated with the Prussian Ministry of Education, served as the regime's intellectual voice. He had worn the party badge until 1938. And when his own teacher, Edmund Husserl, was barred from the faculty under the anti-Semitic purges, Heidegger had signed the official circular forbidding Husserl from entering the university grounds. Arendt would later single this out as one of the actions she found hardest to forgive. Hannah had at first seen this clearly. In an essay from 1946 called "What is Existence Philosophy?", she went after him with something close to fury. She argued that Heidegger's vision of the isolated self, the self stripped of world and others, produced what she called an over-self. By this, she meant a dangerous collective ego, a self that surrenders its individuality and merges entirely into the mass, ready to be organized into something monstrous. It was, she suggested, a philosophy that could lead a man to the swastika without ever having to leave his desk. The essay was sharp. It was unsparing. And then, somewhere between that essay and the dining room in Freiburg, she began to walk it back. Through the 1950s and 60s, she became, in effect, his American agent. She secured translators. She negotiated with publishers. She placed his work in the hands of editors who would treat it kindly. When her friend Leslie Faber, a psychiatrist who moved in her New York circle and knew her well, pressed her on Heidegger's role in Husserl's removal, she wrote back with a defense that surprised even her admirers. She doubted, she said, that Heidegger had really understood what Nazism was. He had learned quickly enough, she insisted. And then she asked, with audible irritation, whether scholars living in what she called the Republic of Letters, that old 18th century idea of a borderless community of European thinkers, really had to interrogate one another about old party memberships from 30 years ago. In 1969, she went further. For his 80th birthday, she wrote a public tribute in which Heidegger's complicity was recast as the bungling of a thinker stranded among the affairs of men. She compared him to Plato at the court of the Syracusan tyrant. "Great minds," she wrote, "blow on a wind that does not spring from the century they happen to live in." Years earlier, in a private entry in her diary in 1953, she had written something far stranger and more revealing. The fable of the fox who builds his own trap, crawls into it, and cannot find his way out. That image had stayed in her journal unpublished, while the public tribute took its softer shape. The cost of this rehabilitation she paid privately. She wrote to her closest friend, the novelist Mary McCarthy, with a candour that still aches to read. All her life with Heidegger, she confessed, she had pretended she could barely count to 3, and sometimes to 4. She had pulled the wool over his eyes. And when she sent him the German edition of The Human Condition, with a note suggesting she might have dedicated it to him if things between them had ever been different, he never replied. Earlier, when she had sent him The Origins of Totalitarianism, he delivered a sublime put-down, telling her directly that he couldn't read English and that perhaps his wife could take a look. The blind spot did not stop with him. The same woman who had outrun the Gestapo and conquered a male intellectual establishment was, on the question of women's emancipation, almost reactionary. She was suspicious of women who gave orders. She doubted whether women should lead. She had little patience for the social ambitions of women's liberation. And in The Human Condition, the absence of women from the public realm, from the very life of action she so prized, went entirely unremarked, as one critic put it, stared straight through unseeing. A similar prejudice coloured her attitude toward Eastern European Jews, whose accents and poverty offended the polished German Jewish self-image she had carried with her since Königsberg. She had written in her essay Truth and Politics that universities exist precisely to hold unwelcome truths against the tide of collective self-deception. Her own life suggests how hard that is, even for those who have made the demand most loudly. Chapter 15. Arendt for the 21st Century. 50 years have now passed since that December evening in 1975, when Hannah slumped over at her dinner table mid-conversation and slipped out of the world. And yet the books she left behind have refused to settle into anything resembling peace. They are still being pulled in opposite directions, still being claimed and reclaimed, still being argued over by people who cannot quite agree on what she meant or whose side she would have been on, if indeed she would have taken a side at all. The first to try were the neoconservatives, and here it helps to pause, because the word has shifted in our own time. These were not the cable news pundits of the 21st century, but a particular cluster of late 20th century right-wing intellectuals, many of them former leftists, who sought a Cold War mascot. They lifted her totalitarianism thesis from its careful surroundings and waved it like a banner, freedom on one side, tyranny on the other, with everything in between conveniently forgotten. What they preferred not to mention was her scalding critique of Western imperialism, or her open contempt for the nation-state itself, which she had blamed for producing the very catastrophes they claimed she had diagnosed. The trouble is, her work simply refuses to sit still for that kind of portrait. She had built something her readers would later call anti-foundationalist, a philosophy unmoored from absolute truths, from divine commandments, from any fixed point above the human world from which one might issue final verdicts. She believed, as one of her interpreters put it, in the priority of democracy to philosophy. She mistrusted anyone who claimed to derive political action from rules handed down from somewhere outside of politics itself. The more interesting reception, the one that hums with current relevance, has been on the left. There, her map of totalitarianism reads like a weather report for our own democratic erosion. The manufactured loneliness she described, the destruction of shared reality, the seepage of political pressure into the most private corners of life, all of it sounds eerily contemporary. Her diagnosis was written about the 1930s and 40s. It feels, somehow, as though it were written last Tuesday. Her theory of the public sphere has lived on in the movements that practice horizontalism, that grassroots, leaderless way of organizing where everyone has an equal voice. Occupy Wall Street drew on it. Local mutual aid networks draw on it. General assemblies, direct democracy, the long evening meetings in church basements and town squares, they trace a quiet line back to her recovery of the public space as something more than a marketplace for redistribution. Politics for her was an agonistic stage. The word comes from the Greek agon, meaning a healthy contest, a public debate, the friction of free people speaking and being seen. She offered something else, too, the idea of alienated citizenship, a deliberate distance the citizen keeps from the crowd, from the easy thrill of flag-waving patriotism, from doing what's always been done just because it's always been done. She drew it from Socrates, the old gadfly of Athens, who pestered people in the marketplace with questions until their certainties fell apart in their hands. What is justice? What is courage? The more they tried to answer, the less they knew. That was his gift. He paralyzed them on purpose, so they would have to actually think, the stop and think, she called it. A pause, right before action, that could save a person from doing something monstrous. Her warning was stark. Watching ordinary Germans become accomplices to mass murder, she had noticed something chilling. The people most certain of their old values were the first to swap them when a new regime offered new ones. The man who believed firmly in God and country, handed a new set of beliefs, simply picked them up and went on believing firmly. She called this kind of belief a banister, a handrail you grip as you walk through life so you don't have to think about where your feet are going. And the terrifying thing about a handrail is that it can always be swapped for another. The Socratic mind refused all handrails. It kept its balance through thinking itself, through that inner argument between you and you that she called the two-in-one. That is what tyrannies destroy first. Not your freedom of movement, but your freedom to disagree with yourself. However, there is much of her thinking that people still argue over, her mishandling of what she called the social question, her strange separation of economic suffering from political freedom, her failure at Little Rock, the methodology her later readers adopted of thinking, as they put it, with Arendt against Arendt, using her framework to critique her own conclusions, is perhaps the most honest tribute her work has ever received. What endures, in the end, is the posture of the radically estranged theorist, the exile's cold and clarifying eye. The reader is pulled, gently, and then not so gently, out of the cave of comfortable democracy and made to confront the frailty of human affairs. She offered no banister. She would not give us one. What she offered instead was a sentence, almost embarrassingly modest after everything else. What I propose, therefore, is very simple. It is nothing more than to think what we are doing. That is where our story ends. If you've stayed with us all the way to here, thank you. It means a great deal. And once again, an enormous thank you to all our YouTube members and Patreons. Your support is the reason these videos exist. If you'd like to join them, you'll find the links in the description below. And if this episode moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover the channel. Until next time, this has been History After Dark. Goodbye.